be with you. I'm so thankful to be here to talk about looking at ways in which that prison becomes the policy of last resort rather than in so many of our countries, particularly the United States, the policy of first resort. For the past many decades, I have been working on prison reform. I have been working on improving prison conditions for women, of introducing measures that align with their gender-based needs. But in the past decade specifically, I've been working with the Thailand Institute of Justice and other folks in Southeast Asia to promote the implementation of the Bangkok rules. In the last couple of years, however, at TIJ and in many places, we see a shift from continuing to look at improving prison conditions, but privileging what we call non-custodial measures. I now see that non-custodial measures should be prioritized, should be privileged. And so many of the speakers made the similar case. We have common cause here, that listening to what many of you have said, and I've been taking notes about what you've said because it really supports my remarks as well. And when we start looking at non-custodial measures as the policy of first resort, it calls into question something that many of you have also suggested, and that is to move away from calling these alternative measures. Because once we call it an alternative, at least in English, that always assumes, in this case, prison is the assumed punishment and anything else is special. So I'd like us, and I borrow this from my colleague Prathahana Rao at the Thailand Institute of Justice, in saying the word alternative itself is problematic. So if we can start using different language like expanding options or non-custodial measures rather than alternatives to the thing that they're supposed to be going to anyway, I think that'll help do some of the things like promoting the ideas within the various spheres of justice as well in the public. I'm gonna talk, and I'm really gonna try to keep to my time here, about investing in women and communities through non-custodial measures, to use the framework of non-custodial measures as a way in which, just as so many of you shared, as a way of which directing attention, directing resource, and again, prioritizing these type of services and programs that should be non-punitive. And that investment also leads us to investing in communities. I put up this word cloud here because I think it really gets at a lot of the things that we talk about. And I think in looking at the ways in which treatment, family, gender sensitive measures, I need to change it and move that word alternative because, as I said, I think that is something that'll help us shift our thinking about that. Looking at children, looking at trauma, all these kinds of things are a very holistic, part of a very holistic approach, again, in helping women achieve more positive outcomes. We know that non-custodial measures in the community, when fully resourced, and my new friend, Professor Yvonne, made this point very clear, that we don't often invest the proper resources. And equally, we tend to blame the person involved rather than understanding the probation services, for example, weren't fully funded, or particularly in the case of women, the services available were not gender responsive, were not gender informed. So I think when we talk about the failure of these non-custodial measures, we also have to bring up the question that sometimes it's an under-resourced, under-trained system rather than an individual flaw. I'm going to briefly make the case for this, what I call the investment model. And simply, the investment model says that societies should look toward funding policies and practice that improve outcomes by investing in all forms of capital. When we talk about the investment model, we need to invest in all forms of capital, whether it's personal capital, such as education or job changing, whether it's social capital, connecting people to goods and services and institutions, again, that create positive outcomes. There's all kinds of ways to invest in women. And here's the thing, when you invest in women, you invest in the children. And so as one of my friends in Kenya says, that just gives me goosebumps every time I say it, when we invest in women, we're investing in the future. And think about that. When we invest in women, we're investing in their children. And of course, as we all know, children are the future for us. So I'm going to make two key points very quickly. First, the rationale for non-custodial measures, all related to the gendered harms of incarceration. And second, what we know about non-custodial measures. Again, trying to keep track of my time here. First, it's well documented throughout the world that women are harmed during incarceration in ways differently than men are harmed. The gendered harms of the prison environment are well documented, and I think they constitute unnecessary suffering. We need to ask ourselves, what is the point of sending so many women to prison? What do we hope to gain from it? We also know that prisons are very counterproductive in terms of protecting women, in terms of helping women maintain dignity, in terms of providing appropriate rehabilitation. And we also know that many women leave prison very destabilized. They've lost track of their children. They've lost track of their families. They have no way to earn a living. And then we wonder why they get in trouble. I just want to end that part by saying prisons are a very expensive solution to a problem they don't solve. We think prisons solve these problems and they don't, and they just cost us a lot of money. I also want to comment very, very quickly that we've seen that prison systems and judicial systems, and again, the idea that it has to be the whole system, totally supported from this end, we've seen with the COVID-19 responsive that around the world, prisons have gone through their populations and they've released women with demanding health challenges. They've released older and pregnant women. They've released women earlier than their release dates, and they've released women from pretrial detention. So I think as horrible as the virus has been to all of our lives, to use this, look, you can let people out with very little negative outcomes. So I think that's one positive thing, if we can say we've learned anything. The rationale for non-custodial measures also is based on women's profiles. Worldwide, the vast majority of women are non-violent first-time offenders. But I wanted to say something kind of in line with some of the earlier presenters. We need to think about these non-custodial measures for long-term offenders too. Yes, the first step is to get the lower level, the short sentence, the non-violent. That's pretty easy to sell, probably anywhere. But I think the next track is to think about, particularly with women who get long sentences. For example, the majority of female lifers are first-termers, at least first-termers in the United States, meaning they had no criminal background. And almost always the person that was killed was involved in some kind of intimate partner relationship. Now that's very, very different from men in a lot of categories. But I think non-custodial measures, again, kind of easy pickings, as we would say in the US, to think about low-level, nonviolent, short sentences. But I just want us all to open our mind to think about ways in which non-custodial measures for women can also be applied to the longer time. The rationale for non-custodial measures, again, makes us acknowledge the gendered harm and unnecessary suffering that women undergo while in prison. Part of that is sexual assault and harassment from staff, but part of it is being separated from their families, being separated from their communities, and really discounting the realities that women will face when they come home. So these policy actions, I think, open the door to a larger discussion about how women can be more safely and more productively supervised within their own community measures. So non-custodial measures, again, avoid all the problems that are created by putting women in a prison. Usually they're sentenced to a prison very far away. Usually they come from very poor families who can't afford to visit them, so they're separated from their children. Very often prisons aren't designed for the needs of women, and so we miss opportunities. And I think the shift toward not seeing it as an alternative, but seeing it as another option to non-custodial measures help us very much. We have a lot of evidence in the West on the success of non-custodial measures. I've reviewed a lot of research, a lot of the so-called evidence-based literature and corresponding evaluation studies, and they seem to come down to this: improving outcomes for women in terms of their drug use, in terms of their depression and other mental health, in terms of their ability to support themselves and their children, in terms of their being able to make a contribution to the community, comes down to 3 points. First, external services such as education and training, housing supports, childcare, and other resources that target their material needs need to be combined with services such as treatment and therapies that support internal change. So we have external material supports and therapy and rehabilitative efforts to support internal change. Again, across the board in hundreds of studies that I've reviewed, we know that that produces the best outcomes in terms of pro-social behavior, decreased problematic behaviors, and in general, overall success in supervision. Non-custodial measures are community-based solutions. When we talk about these options to incarceration, we need to look at the resources in the community, how they can be leveraged, how they can be increased, again, to address women's pathway needs. Convincingly, the research shows that investing in women-centered programming amplifies the effect of community-based measures. Gender-informed and evidence-based practice is necessary to build the foundation for non-custodial measures. I feel very, very strongly in agreement with the whole system approach, particularly the role of civil society, but the emphasis on law enforcement is really important. That's the first entryway. Are police officers trained and given direction to not see everything as, oh, we're just going to take this person to jail and quit thinking about them? Non-custodial measures with appropriate gender-based services have just shown to produce better outcomes of prison sentences of any kind. We have long invested in the failure of the prison. My charge to you now is that we need to invest in the future success of gender-responsive non-custodial measures. We have the opportunity to change how we spend criminal justice criminal justice monies at this point. I want to close by talking about the Bangkok rules. We find guidance for reforming women's prisons in the Bangkok rules, but what we're now promoting at TIJ and with my friends at Prison Reform International is exactly that. The rules that outline, give us the direction, provide guidance for non-custodial measures throughout every aspect of the system. I will make the toolkit available to Marin so she can distribute it, but it goes through every aspect, including law enforcement, the courts, et cetera. I now see the future of prison rights reform is a non-custodial measure. We need to stop this non-ending flow of women into prisons. Another document I'll send talks about how the Bangkok rules can be used to reform drug policy that I think all of you find very interested. So I'll close with this. Implementing these non-custodial measures for women and for men too, I just happen to know more about the women, It's not a mystery. We don't have to figure it out. It's a puzzle. We have the pieces, and all we have to find is the will. Thank you very much for listening to me.